Well, good afternoon and welcome to the February Internal Coordination webinar for the Spring Hydrology Outlook. This is Kelsey Engel from the Central Region ROC. Today's briefing will be a general overview of the Spring Hydrology Outlook for the Mississippi Basin, including the Red River of the North and the Great Lake drainages. This call is being recorded. If you have trouble with the Join Me slides not advancing during the webinar, please close your browser and log in again. Hold all questions until the end of the presentation and use mute and unmute during the webinar with *6 and #6. Today's presenters are Jim Knoll with the Ohio River Forecast Center, Steve Buin from the North Central RFC, Kevin Lowe from the Missouri Basin RFC, James Paul from the Arkansas Red Basin RFC, and Katie Landry from the Lower Mississippi RFC. As a reminder, public products will be issued. The Outlook guidance and probability graphics will be available on web pages today. A webinar will be hosted for National Weather Service state, regional, and national partners coming up tomorrow at 1 o'clock Central Time. And the material presented today will be the same material that will be presented to those partners coming up again tomorrow. Just a reminder, the webinar is being recorded, and a follow-up email will be sent with information on how to access both of these recordings. So with that, we'll hand it over to Jim Knoll with the Ohio River Forecast Center for today's presentation.
All right. Thank you, Kelsey, and good afternoon, everyone. So we're going to kind of go through an overview of the basic hydrometeorological state in the Mississippi drainage and up into the Red River of the North and the Great Lakes. And then we'll be going by River Forecast Center around, starting at the Ohio River Forecast Center and then rotating around. So to begin with, on the first slide that is currently on your screen, it shows the from the Midwest Regional Climate Center the departure from normal precipitation since December the 1st. And what I did is, on the lower right, the smaller image is just a small reference to last winter at the same kind of time frame. And this winter, we've got generally in the light green or yellow colors is at or below normal precipitation. So you see actually pretty widespread, anywhere from 50 to 100% of normal precipitation covering much of the upper Midwest through far western Great Lakes and down into the Ohio Valley, mid-Mississippi Valley, and even into parts of the lower Mississippi Valley. Within there's some even drier areas in eastern North Dakota and Minnesota, as well as western Tennessee and northeast Arkansas. We do also have at or above normal precipitation in the western high plains into the northern Rockies. But again, if you look at that smaller image, even those areas, in general, except for maybe parts of Colorado and into Nebraska, and that even those areas are not as wet as last year. But certainly the antecedent conditions last winter were much wetter across the upper Midwest into the Great Lakes, Ohio, Tennessee valleys, and mid-Mississippi Valley relative to this year, where we see a little bit of wetting this year relative to last year in the western portions of the Arkansas Red Basin and up into a little bit of the Missouri Basin. But overall, we are generally drier this winter relative to last winter. On the next slide, you will see our temperature departure this year compared to last winter, and the smaller image again. In general, across the Mississippi drainage, we're seeing normal to slightly above normal temperatures this winter. Now, this current Arctic outbreak, of course, is going to pull back a little bit on these temperatures, but again, over a 3-month period, it may make a degree or so change to the cooler side. But certainly in the upper Midwest, in the northern portions, northeast portions of the Missouri Basin into the upper Mississippi Basin and into parts of the Great Lakes, even though we've had periods of cold weather this winter, it is certainly not nearly as cold as last winter when we had temperatures 5 to 10 degrees below normal. We're seeing in portions of the Great Lakes 1 to 3 degrees below normal on average since December 1st. And then in the western high plains into the upper Missouri Basin, temperatures are running about 1 to 3 degrees above normal for the winter. And the rest of the area is pretty close to normal. So, on the next slide is our winter snowfall to date. And of course, you know, with snowfall like precipitation, you get a wide degree of variance. We see pockets of above normal snowfall in the northern Rockies, as well as like in Kentucky from this recent snowstorm that went through there. But again, if you look at that smaller image on the lower right, just to give you a reference again to last winter, certainly the upper Midwest, Great Lakes, Ohio Valley, mid-Mississippi Valley was much snowier last winter. For the most part, we're seeing a big area of generally at or below normal snowfall across the Mississippi drainage this year. Again, there are those pockets. One of the things is, though, in the upper Missouri Basin, we've had above normal temperatures. So, again, that has eaten away at a lot of that snowpack, as we'll look at in just a minute. As we do turn to the snow water content on the next slide here, comparing last year on the left image to this year on the right image, one of the things on that right image that should be noted then is that we see a lot of light gray. That water content is very shallow, and generally water equivalents are on the order of tenths of an inch. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 tenths of an inch. So not a lot of water content, even though you do see really more gray on there than last year at this time. But the other thing that you'll really notice is in the northern high plains and the upper Midwest into the Great Lakes, we do not have nearly the snow water content that we did at this time last year. Most of our water content in the Mississippi drainage as well as the Great Lakes is generally an inch or less. We do have those pockets, the preferred pockets around like Lake Superior where you get several inches of water content. But again, the message here is our overall water content as a whole in the basin is generally at or below average and certainly less than last year. The one exception I will highlight is in just because we have an event coming up this weekend is in Kentucky and Tennessee where they do have a decent amount of water content around an inch. As we look on the next slide at our soil moisture, again, because our precipitation has generally not been that wet and we have not had that much snow this year across the upper Midwest into the Ohio Valley, mid-Mississippi Valley, the soil water content, or the soil moisture, is generally at or below normal. The one exception is in the upper Missouri Basin, which is still at or above normal in many places. In terms of a drought status, one thing that we've seen during the late fall into the winter season is an expansion of the abnormally dry conditions in parts of the Dakotas and Minnesota, as well as some drought that continues to develop in portions of the Tennessee and Ohio Valley. At the same time, we continue to see in the Arkansas Red Basin the persistent drought that's really been going on now for at least a few years in that area. As we look now at the USGS streamflow conditions, again, kind of reflecting basically what we've seen from the precipitation patterns and snow patterns, is a wide area of at or below normal streamflow across a good portion of the central and lower Mississippi Valley into the Ohio Valley. Pretty close to normal. Again, a lot of the reporting stations don't report during the winter ice season in the upper Midwest. We do see some above normal streamflow conditions still in the northern Rockies. As we shift to the Army Corps of Engineers storage that is available in their different divisions, I don't have them all in yet. I'm trying to get them for tomorrow's call. But in general, I expect SWD will be about 99.9%. NWD for the Missouri is 95%. In the Ohio Basin, it's 99%. And then down in the Mississippi Valley Division, again, it'll be in the upper 90s. So the bottom line here is the Army Corps of Engineers has ample storage available this year for flood control operations. Now shifting gears a little bit into the forecast mode that'll lead us into our spring flood outlook. We do have a storm system over the next 7 days that'll be moving across the mid-Mississippi Valley into the Tennessee and Ohio Valley, and should produce anywhere from 1/2 of an inch up to 2, 3, 4 inches. The main focus will be in a little bit of the eastern area of the mid-Mississippi Valley and on into the Tennessee and Ohio Valley with that storm system. So the primary threat for heavy rain with this storm system will be in the lower Ohio, Tennessee, and Cumberland Valley. At the same time, very light precipitation with that split flow going on in the upper Midwest and northern Mississippi Valley. In terms of moving out beyond that into the 8 to 14 day outlook, we'll continue to have that persistent split flow. with the northern jet stream driving cold air down from the polar regions into the upper Midwest, Great Lakes, and eastern Mississippi Valley especially, while at the same time a southern jet stream will be bringing the more preferred rain and storm track from the western U.S. into the southern Mississippi Valley and then shifting on up into portions of the lower Ohio valleys. At the same time, with that split flow, below normal precipitation is expected to continue from the 7-day period into that 8 to 14-day period across portions of the Great Lakes into the upper Midwest. Looking further ahead, these are the new Climate Prediction Center outlooks, and this is the March outlook. They've revised the temperatures from being at or above normal in the upper Midwest and Great Lakes to now being forecast to be a little bit below normal, with equal chances of temperatures across the rest of the Mississippi drainage. As for precipitation, in general, they're just going with equal chances. The exception would be in portions of the lower Ohio, Tennessee, and Cumberland valleys, where above normal precipitation is forecast. Shifting further ahead to the 90-day outlook, running from March through May, now they're forecasting temperatures across the lower Mississippi Valley into the Arkansas and Red Basin of generally below normal temperatures and equal chances across the remainder of a good portion, at least, of the Mississippi drainage. A little bit of the northern upper portion of the Missouri Basin is forecast to see above normal temperatures. And for precipitation, they're going equal chances across a good portion of the central part of the country. In response to a very, we're kind of not quite to El Nino signal there, but we are getting some atmospheric response. There's definitely indications in the climate models of maybe some wetness in the western portion of the Arkansas and Red Basin and on up into portions of the Missouri Basin in the Rockies. The latest drought outlook that I had to pull from basically is more of the same persistence from that drought monitor. The exception would be is if we wet up in portions of Colorado and northeast New Mexico kind of area, we could see some improvement in drought conditions in those western areas. Now I'm going to go ahead and shift into the flood outlook for the Mississippi drainage, including the Great Lakes and the Hudson drainage of the upper Midwest. And basically, the big message is because precipitation and snowpack is generally at or below normal, the bottom line is what's really going to drive this spring flood season is really going to be the weather systems of rain. Now, there's still time for, as Kevin will talk about in the Missouri and Steve will talk about in the upper Midwest, there's still time to add snow water content in those areas of the Missouri and the upper Mississippi drainage, but that time is beginning to run shorter as each week goes along. So the bottom line is because the snow water content and along with the antecedent conditions are at or a little bit drier than average across a good portion of the area, we're expecting generally the flood risk is at or a little bit below normal as a whole. There are details within that, but in general, this is probably one of the quieter years that we've seen, compared to, like, say, a 2011 kind of year. At the same time, though, if you want to really slice it and dice it, if right now it looks like the northern portion of the Mississippi drainage is at or a little bit below normal, whereas we work south, it's getting closer to average. And that's that area of circled where we have the 50% chance or greater of flooding. You see most of those colors of the oranges and a few reds for moderate floods. They're generally in the mid-Mississippi Valley into portions of the western Ohio, Tennessee, Cumberland Valley, and down into the lower Mississippi Valley relative to the remainder of the basin. So with that, now we're going to shift into each individual river forecast center area and have a little bit more of discussion. So we're going to go ahead and begin with, on the next slide, the Ohio River Basin. And what we're expecting is kind of a twofold area for the Ohio Valley. In the northern basin of northern Indiana and northern Ohio, we're expecting normal to slightly reduced risk of flooding relative to normal. It still means that we are expecting some minor floods, and there is plenty of ice out there in Pennsylvania, northern Ohio, and northern Indiana on the rivers. So there is the chance of some ice jam flooding. If we can get the timing of snowmelt as we go into March, along with rainfall, with that ice pack, there could be some problems up there. And especially with cold weather, our ice pack on those rivers has been thickening here in the last week or two as well. But the main area to focus in the Ohio Basin would be in the lower Ohio Basin down into the Cumberland area. Even there, we're expecting a seasonal or near normal flood risk. And that'll be primarily driven by rainfall, okay? That we do have that snowpack, and that will be coming out in Kentucky and Tennessee this weekend. But after that, it'll be mainly, as typically is the case, springtime showers and thunderstorms will be driving those flood threats in those areas. And finally, for the Ohio Basin here, as I get ready to summarize it, I do want to highlight, at least in the very short term, we use a short-term 7-day ensemble forecasting system here at the Ohio River Forecast Center, and that link is at the bottom, and that covers all of the Eastern River Forecast Centers as well. And I zoomed in on portions of southern Indiana, and especially down into Kentucky and Tennessee, where this weekend we do expect 1/2 to 1 inch of snow water content to melt, along with 2 to isolated areas of up to 4 inches of rain, especially in western Kentucky and western Tennessee. That could promote some minor and a few preferred areas that typically get moderate floods in eastern Kentucky. It'll all depend on the exact storm track and that kind of stuff, but in general we're expecting a minor flood event in the lower Ohio Basin down into the Cumberland Basin of Tennessee over this weekend. So in summary, for the Ohio and Cumberland Basins, our rainfall is forecast not too far from normal over the next 3 months. Our snow water content is normal to below normal, with the exceptions of Kentucky, where we do have about 1 inch of water equivalent on the ground right now, and that is above normal. But we do expect most of that to come out this weekend. We also do have above normal snow water content near Lake Erie from a lot of the lake effect snow events over this winter. Generally, minor flooding is expected this late winter and the spring in the Ohio River Basin. And generally, our risk is considered about normal for a good portion of the basin, slightly below normal possibly in the northwestern watershed. And finally, rainfall and thunderstorms will be the primary determinant of spring flooding. So with that, I'm going to now go ahead and turn it over to Steve Buen at the North Central River Forecast Center to talk about the upper Midwest.
Okay, thanks, Jim. We'll start off here with what we show as our simulated snow water content, which is a proxy for the accumulated precipitation over the winter period. And what you can see here, looking at areas that are green and blue up in the Great Lakes, that's pretty much driven by the lake effect snow engine that's been going on. We saw all that snow that occurred out east, got all the press. Well, we were getting lake effect snow in the up in the western lakes too at the same time. And so they've picked that up, picked up the heavier accumulations, which are fairly near to slightly above normal for them for this time of the year. You can also see some of that in western lower Michigan too, with some of the lighter colors, kind of your greens and yellows there, where they've picked it up. What is remarkable about the rest of the map is the kind of striped nature you see in the light browns and the dark browns, indicating where you can actually pick out the synoptic scale weather events that have crossed the upper Midwest this winter, and you can basically count it on one hand how many times that's happened. So we've got a very scattered snowpack out there, scattered wet areas, principally looking from eastern Iowa across northern Illinois, northern Indiana into southern lower Michigan. That was one of the larger events that went across the area. And we'll see in detail why their risk is a little bit higher. But when you get into Minnesota and North Dakota, really with this northwest flow pattern, we have not picked up synoptic scale weather events systems across that area to paint much of a coherent picture of snow accumulation. In fact, it's nearly brown everywhere in the southern two-thirds of Minnesota and eastern North Dakota. Next slide, please. So let's look at the Great Lakes and focus in here a little bit. And we'll start with that slight enhanced flood risk area across south central lower Michigan, extending from the Grand Basin over into the basins in the Detroit area. And even though we only see a few dots there that indicate 50% risk at minor flooding, that's about a 20 to 30% increase over what would be your seasonal normal for this period of time. And so we do expect that with a typical weather pattern maybe evolving into the March, maybe early April timeframe, that we'll see some scattered minor flooding across Michigan. At least that's probably one of the best risks for flooding in the NCRFC area this spring. Elsewhere into northern Indiana, the Great Lakes drainages of southwest Michigan, northern Indiana, eastern Wisconsin, and the rest of the area, we're seeing a very seasonal risk for flooding there. Flooding may occur maybe at that 30% level typically, and so we're not seeing that skew up to the 50% level where we would color the dots in here. And we're also seeing there's an adequate, we expect that there'll be adequate seasonal runoff for hydropower uses here, filling up reservoirs that get drained down over the winter, that we're seeing what we see as a seasonal normality here so far. But when you get into the western lakes up there in the arrowhead of Minnesota, we're seeing a distinct lack of accumulation of snow there, and we see that there'll probably be more of a risk of too little runoff to refill some of those lakes up there unless we can start to get some southwest flow and get those types of storms and bring in some moisture into that area. Next slide, please. Moving across over to the Hudson Bay drainages of North Dakota and northwest Minnesota, here we got a little bit of a dichotomy going on here. If you get into the real detail of where the lack of precipitation over, say, the last 6 months has been, it's been from about the Devil's Lake area eastward, and southeast is where that real lack of precipitation's been. You get westward into the Souris Basin, they've had a little bit more fall precipitation and winter precip over there, so we're seeing the normal seasonal flood risk over there in that area. But when you get over into the Red River Valley, I'd say over the last 5 to 6 years, I maybe can't remember ever all the sites being less than 50% chance of reaching flood stage in the spring period. This is where the drought covers a significant percentage of the basin, a D1 drought. It would take a pretty remarkable change in pattern here to get anything going in the Hudson Bay area. Next slide, please. The upper Mississippi is kind of a little bit of a tale of two things going on here, with the Minnesota section being that drought, approaching drought. We don't have a designated D1 drought yet, it's D0, but definitely looking at expansion of that if we don't get the spring rains to come. And it's, again, a substantially reduced flood risk there with no sites indicating 50%. But as you move southeastward towards, say, eastern Iowa over to northern Indiana, flood risk goes to seasonal to slightly enhanced in the just south of Chicago, in that upper reaches of the Illinois main stem over into the Kankakee. We've seen a couple bouts of minor flooding over there in the winter with some thaws that we had back in January. Soils are a little wetter over there, but again, very isolated in nature, because as you move south again, it's had less precipitation there, and so the colored dots you see are there along the main stem, Illinois, and not the tributaries in central Illinois. And then as it all accumulates and it all reads down the Mississippi down to just north before the Missouri comes in, we're seeing that seasonal flood risk return, the counterbalancing of the enhanced risk to the east and the lower risk to the northwest. It all comes out in the wash there around the St. Louis area to the seasonal risk. So next slide. So again, with that roller coaster we've had with the temperatures this winter, we've had some staying power in our ice problems in Wisconsin and Illinois especially, and over into Michigan. And we expect that those will go on as we keep the roller coaster going with the cold temperatures now, probably go swing back to warm. it's going to have to be rain-driven if we're going to get significant flooding. With the frozen ground that now extends all the way down to the southern Illinois area, runoff could be enhanced with frozen ground, so be on the alert for that. If you see a rainstorm coming and you got frozen ground that's 2 or more inches, you definitely be looking at that. And again, Illinois and southern Michigan. That's all I got, so I'll turn it over to Kevin Lau.
Thank you, Steve. This is Kevin with the Missouri Basin. So let me start off by saying that in general, we're projecting a normal to somewhat below normal risk for flooding within the Missouri Basin. So this first slide, we're looking at the mountains. The left-hand plot shows the mountainous basin snowpack conditions in percent of normal snow water equivalent. Snowpack conditions in the mountains can be categorized as near average for almost all the mountainous west, with the exception of the North Platte and the Milk, and where their higher snowpacks are a bit below average. The February water supply forecast that was developed by the Natural Resources Conservation Service and collaborated with our office was issued Tuesday, and the summary graphic is shown on the right. This most recent water supply forecast reflects conditions as of February the 1st, and it suggests that we're going to see an average mountain snowmelt runoff season in 2015 overall, with the North Platte contribution being below normal, so that's where the exception would be. So the next slide, I show this every year. This is a typical snow water equivalent accumulation plot for a snowtail location in the headwaters of the Yellowstone. And I show this graph to illustrate just how far along we are in the mountain accumulating season. The light blue trace is the historic accumulation for the past 30 years. And so for this date, on February the 19th, we're typically about 70% of the way through the snow accumulating period. So as was already said, we've still got a little ways to go before we know the full picture as far as the mountain snowpack goes. And so that's just the idea I wanted to convey with this plot. Next slide, please. Oh, wait. Well, yeah. So with an average mountain snowpack, our long-range river stage projections do not indicate the likelihood for significant flooding due to mountain snowmelt alone. Okay, so moving on then to the plains with the next slide, thanks. And again, you've already seen this slide once before, but there is a fairly widespread blanket of snow in the plains, but as has already been said, it's quite shallow. There are some 2-inch snow water reports in the headwaters of the James River Basin up in North Dakota, and of course some larger amounts in the Black Hills in South Dakota. But in general, as Jim has already said, the majority of the reports are in the tenths, and in the Missouri Basin it's like 1/3 of an inch or less as far as the liquid equivalent. Okay, so now moving on to more of a watershed by watershed kind of analysis here. Snow conditions are, or it's not snow, but soil conditions are somewhat of a mixed bag. We think that the upper few inches are wetter than normal for much of the plains area, but we also believe that the deeper soils are drier than normal. Again, our uncertainty points out the need for soil moisture measurements. But anyway, as Steve alluded to, frozen ground also is a player, and that was evidenced last week, or last few weeks, I guess I should say, in both the Hart and the Knife River basins in North Dakota. And so while we do have just a little plain snowpack, we do believe that the potential exists for some localized minor flooding in the northern plains, due again to rain on frozen ground conditions. Our outlooks do indicate the possibility for minor flooding along the Little Muddy and the Knife Rivers in North Dakota, and in the James and the Big Sioux basins in South Dakota. Also want to mention that higher than normal stream flow conditions in the fall coupled with a series of bitterly cold temperatures alternating with unseasonably warmer temperatures, has led to ice formation and breakup on many of the streams and rivers already this season, and we've seen some ice-induced high water already. But the associated impacts have been localized and relatively minor. But ice jam flooding, as Steve has already mentioned, will continue to be a threat for the next few weeks. And then the next slide. Thank you. So moving now toward the lower third of the basin, convection drives the springtime flooding down here. Of course, any snow that does build up and quickly melts away does help to keep the soil moisture up. But thunderstorm activity is the primary driver of the flooding in the lower third. Long-range forecasts developed by our office this week would suggest the likelihood of minor to moderate flooding this spring in some areas of Iowa, eastern Kansas, and Missouri. Affected river systems include the Floyd and the Little Sioux in Iowa, the Big Blue and the Meridocene in Kansas, the Grand, the Osage, the Chariton, and the Platte Rivers in Missouri, and many of the smaller tributaries that are feeding the Missouri River in the state of Missouri will also experience flooding due to spring rains. And this is typical. And even though I show the Missouri River as in the red, don't be alarmed by that. There is the possibility that the Missouri River below Nebraska City will have a few locations that would exceed minor flood stage in the late spring. Again, this is not atypical. So in summary, and I'll just touch on the last three bullets here, we don't expect any significant flooding due to mountain snowmelt alone. Generally localized minor flooding is possible in the plains due to rain on frozen ground. And then finally, minor to moderate flooding due to convection is likely in Missouri and Kansas and Iowa, and this is typical. And this concludes my brief.
Thanks, Kevin. Good afternoon, everyone. This first graphic basically reiterates the fact that much of the ABRC area continues to experience drought conditions. The top two images show the precipitation since the beginning of the water year in October on the left, and the upper right shows the February precipitation thus far. Pretty much the only places that are above normal are in Colorado and New Mexico and a little bit of southwest Kansas as far as the longer duration precip. The February precipitation in Colorado and New Mexico, it's kind of a little bit, I'm not sure what to say. It is above normal, but again, numerically it's only about a half inch to an inch total, so it's not too drastically wet out there. The bottom left image shows our currently modeled soil moisture conditions. Again, you can see pretty much the center part of our basin is pretty dry. Next slide, please. Snow water equivalent up in the upper reaches of the Arkansas River are slightly below the median values as calculated by the NRCS at about 88 to 89%. Again, much of this snowpack is along the spine of the western and northwestern border of our basin, and it doesn't really extend all the way down into southeast Colorado. The slide on the lower right shows current reservoir storage. That's in relationship to conservation pool. You can see, don't look at the numbers, but generally the green areas, the light green, shows they're slightly below conservation pool. The darker greens are slightly into flood pool. So you can see with much of our area being highly regulated, much of our rivers being highly regulated, we have a lot of flood pool storage available for any convective rains that we may get later this spring. And that's typically where most of our flooding comes from. Next slide, please. Finally, our flood risk is going to be near normal through April. Even though we're in the midst of a drought, our long-range forecasts do show a few points with a greater than 50% probability of flooding. These points, however, have historically flooded greater than 50% of the past years, so that would be why our flood risk is near normal. Now we'll pass it along to Katie.
All right, thanks, James. All right, looking at the graphic here, you can see that we're showing the 60-day departure from normal precipitation. And you can see that we've got drier conditions for the northern skirts of the LMRC area, especially up in the western Tennessee, eastern Arkansas, and northern Mississippi portion, where we're seeing a deficit up to between 2 to 6 inches. I must note that earlier when Jim was showing the forecast precipitation, that next weather system that's going to be coming through is going to be bringing that excess of heavy precipitation to that area, so we'll see how it impacts the drought conditions. But most of that is going to be frozen precipitation, so we're not too confident in it helping too much. But with the precipitation deficit, it's led to some moderate drought conditions for this area. And you can see that represented in the stream flow conditions on the next slide. And this is showing the 28-day average stream flow conditions compared to the historicals. And you can see that we have normal to below normal stream flow conditions along the lower Mississippi portion. Especially, we've got a much below normal conditions on the Yazoo River tributary. And anyway, we're looking at normal to below normal stream flow conditions for most of the area, and that's going to play a role into the flood potential for this coming spring. Going to the next slide, you can see that we're showing, this is excluding the Mississippi River, we're showing a seasonal flooding potential for the tributaries of the Mississippi with just some minor to moderate flooding that's normal for the area. And then as far as the lower Mississippi portion, we're expecting an average to below average spring flood potential. And this is just based on the upstream conditions and the dry conditions that are currently going on. So in summary, going to the next slide, you can see that based on everything that we showed, we've got drier conditions for the majority of the lower Mississippi Valley. This has been over the past 60 days, especially over the last month. And in that portion where we were showing where the drought conditions were, we're seeing definitely below normal conditions there. The flood potential for the Ohio and the upper Miss and Missouri basins are leading to a normal seasonal to below normal conditions for the lower Mississippi portion. And then, of course, for the LMRC area and the tributaries as a whole, seeing normal to below normal conditions with reduced flood potential over the drought areas in Arkansas, Tennessee, and northern Mississippi. Now, with that said, the flood potential will be driven by individual convective rainstorms across the Ohio and Upper Miss and then the Missouri basins. And then, of course, the seasonal flood potential for us over the LMRC area will be driven by individual convective systems as well. And we'll be monitoring these conditions and any changes that occur. But with that, I'm going to pass it back on to Jim.
All right, thank you, Katie. So to go ahead and summarize it, so for 2015, we're considering, generally speaking, normal or a little bit below normal flood risk across a good portion of the Mississippi drainage into the Red River of the north. And again, as Steve said, a lot closer to normal, maybe a few pockets of above normal in the Great Lakes. Snowmelt will not be as big of a contributor this spring season to flooding as we've seen in several of the recent past years. And so spring rains will be needed, and so that's the big wild card here is where we get those spring rains, we could induce some flooding, but again, the lead time of that is, of course, a lot less. And we'll be going ahead and continuing to monitor this, and we'll have an updated briefing for the WFOs on March 4th, and then for the partners will be on March 5th. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kelsey for any questions.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jim, Steve, Kevin, James, and Katie for presenting this afternoon. Appreciate your expertise and sharing the outlook this afternoon. With that, we'll now turn it over to the WFOs that are online for questions. If you would, please state your name, your WFO, and to which RFC your question is. So with that, we'll take the first question. All right, we'll wait just a few more seconds here to see if there are any questions based upon this outlook. A reminder that tomorrow the same presentation will be presented to state, regional, and national partners. That is coming up at 1 o'clock tomorrow afternoon Central Time. Last call for questions to the RFCs.
Kevin, this is Mark at the St. Louis office for Kevin Lau at Missouri Basin.
Hey, Mark.
Hello, sir. I know we talked earlier, but I just wanted to clarify something. Most of the red dots we see across western Missouri, those are pretty much for this time of year. I mean, we don't. That's a normal display, I suppose.
I'm sorry, you cut out just a bit. Somebody hung up, I guess. Are you asking if the moderate?
Most of the red dots that we're seeing on your forecast map across western Missouri, those are typical. That's a normal display for the spring flood outlook in that area. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yes. Yep.
Okay. So we should, as far as the main stem is concerned along the Missouri, there's really no reason to think that the main stem would have any elevated risk of flooding. It should be pretty much near normal.
Yeah, if not below.
If not below. I guess what I'm saying is that those numbers that kind of imply maybe an elevated flood risk that you sent out to David, Scott, and myself and others earlier this week, we probably shouldn't put a lot of weight on that.
That is most certainly true.
Thank you.
Yep, that was a poor man's ESP.
Very good. Thank you.
Yep, you betcha. Good question.
Thanks, Mark, for the question. Now, does anybody else have any additional questions to the RFCs? All right, hearing none, appreciate your participation this afternoon on today's presentation. Again, just a reminder, the same presentation will be presented to the partners tomorrow at 1 o'clock, and then we'll provide another update to the WFOs coming up on Wednesday, March the 4th.